The hall was big enough to swallow a city. Thousands of alien delegates sat in curved rows that stretched upward like the inside of a shell. Lights floated at different heights, each one tuned to the homeworld brightness of whatever species sat beneath it. The air smelled of 17 different atmospheres, running through 17 different filter systems. It was, by any measure, an impressive place. And once again, it was the place where humanity was told it did not belong. Ambassador Daniel Voss sat in the human delegation box on the far left side of the chamber. He had been sitting in that same box, in that same chair, for 11 years. Every 3 years, the Galaxy Consortium held its grand membership review. Every 3 years, humanity submitted its application for full charter membership. And every 3 years, the result was the same. He did not even flinch when the result came in. The motion for full charter membership of the Terran species is denied, said the consortium speaker, a tall Velhari with pale blue skin and 4 thin arms. His voice was flat, almost bored. The species classification remains provisional. The chamber did not erupt. There was no drama. A few delegates looked over at the human box briefly, then looked away. Some were already checking their data slates for the next agenda item. Voss stared straight ahead. Provisional. That was the word. That had always been the word. After 190 years of membership, after 2 centuries of humans fighting in consortium wars, building consortium stations, mapping consortium space, healing, consortium, sick, the official classification of humanity in galactic law was still provisional. It meant no voting rights, no seat on any major council, no say in any decision that affected the thousands of worlds under consortium rule. It meant, in plain language, that humanity was useful, but not trusted. Welcome, but not equal. Voss gathered his papers slowly. Around him, his staff did the same. Nobody spoke. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said 11 years ago, or 20 years before that, or 50 years before that. He walked out of the chamber without looking back. 3 weeks later, the colony ship Marin's Hope was crossing through the Kepler Reach when a Velhari peacekeeping fleet opened fire on it. The official consortium report, released 4 days after the incident, described it as a border misidentification. The Marin's Hope had allegedly failed to broadcast its identification signal at the required frequency. The Velhari fleet commander had followed standard protocol. 312 people died. Families, engineers, a school group of 40 children who had been traveling to join their parents at the Kepler station settlement. The Consortium Grand Council met in emergency session. After 6 hours of debate, they released a joint statement. It expressed deep regret at the unfortunate loss of life, and called for a thorough internal review of border identification procedures. It was a footnote. Not even an apology. A footnote. Secretary General Mara Osei read the statement at her desk in Geneva at 3 in the morning. She read it twice. Then she set it down, folded her hands on the table, and sat quietly for a long time. She was 61 years old. She had spent 30 years in public service. She had attended 4 consortium summits, negotiated 7 trade agreements, and personally overseen the deployment of human medical teams to 11 alien worlds suffering from disease outbreaks. Worlds that had never once thanked Earth publicly, because thanking a provisional species was not considered diplomatically necessary. She picked up her pen and began to write. The global parliament of Earth had not been this full in decades. Every seat was taken. Every screen in every city on every continent was tuned to the same feed. People stood in streets, in marketplaces, in the low-gravity corridors of orbital stations, watching the tall woman in the dark suit walk to the podium. Mara Osei did not use notes. She spoke for 22 minutes. She talked about the first human ambassador who had walked into a consortium chamber 200 years ago, nervous and hopeful, believing that the galaxy was a place of fairness. She talked about every war humans had fought under consortium banners, wars for species who had never learned human names. She talked about the doctors and the engineers and the pilots and the builders who had given their lives to a union that classified them as provisional. And then she talked about 312 people who had died because a Velhari commander, could not be bothered to wait for an identification signal. "They do not respect us," she said. Her voice was calm. "They never intended to. We built their roads. We healed their sick. We bled in their wars. And we are still a footnote." She paused. No more. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, the Parliament erupted. The Terran Severance Declaration was transmitted to the Consortium headquarters on a Tuesday morning, Earth Standard Time. It was a precise document 41 pages long, written in Galactic Standard, as required by Consortium communication law, though this would be the last time Earth followed that particular rule. It outlined, in careful and unemotional language, the dissolution of every treaty, trade agreement, military contract, research partnership, and communication protocol between Earth and the Galaxy Consortium. A 90-day wind-down period was given, as required by the exit clauses buried deep in the original membership agreement clauses. The Consortium had included assuming no species would ever actually use them. The Velhari ambassador to Earth, a senior diplomat named Orath Vel, received the transmission and read it 3 times before calling his home government. When he finally got through to the Grand Council, his first words were, "They are serious." The Council's initial response was amusement. Several senior Velhari officials were quoted in galactic press, calling the declaration a political performance. One council member described it publicly as a child throwing a tantrum. The joke spread quickly across the Consortium's communication networks. Humans cutting ties with the galaxy? Humans, who had no full voting rights and no military fleet to match the Velhari. It was, in the opinion of most Consortium members, a bluff, a dramatic gesture that would collapse under its own weight within weeks. Earth would come back. They always came back. They needed the Consortium more than the Consortium needed them. Everyone knew that. What no one in the Consortium knew, what no alien diplomat or intelligence service had managed to figure out in 190 years, was that humanity had been quietly preparing for this moment for a very long time. Not because they had planned to leave, but because humans were, at their core, a practical species. They had learned, through centuries of difficult history on their own world, that depending entirely on someone else's goodwill was the same as having no plan at all. So they had built, quietly, carefully, and without announcing it to anyone, deep beneath the surface of Mars, in asteroid facilities disguised as mining operations, in research stations officially registered as weather monitoring posts. The work had been going on for 30 years. Engineers and scientists who had never spoken to the press. Projects with budget codes that meant nothing to outside auditors. The 90-day window began. On Earth, there were no protests, no fear. People went to work. Children went to school. Somewhere in the Pacific, a man grilled fish on the beach and watched the stars come out one by one, not worried at all. The galaxy had no idea what was coming. On the 61st day of the wind-down period, the Consortium's deep space relay network went quiet. Not all at once. It happened in stages, the way a fire goes out. First the edges, then the middle, then the last ember blinking into darkness. Stations that had hummed continuously for decades simply stopped transmitting. Data streams that carried trade figures, medical updates, military orders, and diplomatic correspondence across 40 star systems slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. For 2 days, Consortium technical teams assumed it was a system fault. They ran diagnostics. They sent repair drones. They held emergency calls at strange hours trying to locate the source of the failure. It took them 48 hours to understand what should have been obvious from the start. The relay network backbone, the deep infrastructure that made fast communication across the Consortium possible, had been built largely by human engineers over the course of a century. Human companies had won the contracts. Human technicians had maintained the systems. And those systems, it turned out, required a continuous authentication signal broadcast from Earth-registered servers to keep running. The authentication signal had stopped on day 60 of the wind-down period. Quietly, without announcement. When Consortium officials contacted Earth to ask about the outage, they received a polite, automated response. It explained that all Terran communication services were currently being redirected toward domestic use. and that the consortium was welcome to develop its own relay infrastructure at its earliest convenience. The message ended with a standard legal notice, informing the consortium that all previously licensed human communication technology would enter lockdown at the end of the 90-day period, in accordance with intellectual property protections under galactic law. The same galactic law the consortium had written. The first real panic came from the outer reach. 17 star systems in the consortium's eastern sectors relied on asteroid mining to feed their industrial economies. The scheduling of those mining operations, which rocks to crack, in what order, with what equipment, routed to which processing stations, was managed by a logistics firm called HFY Vance Orbital, a quiet human company based out of Ganymede that most consortium officials had never heard of. When HFY Vance Orbital ended its service contracts on day 70, the mining schedules collapsed. Ships arrived at asteroids that had already been stripped. Processing stations waited for deliveries that never came. 2 stations in the Dyraki home system ran out of raw materials within a week and had to shut down assembly lines that had been running continuously for 60 years. The Dyraki trade minister sent an urgent message to his consortium contact, a Velhari official named Subdirector Perith. The message was simple. What do we do now? Perith had no answer. The problem was not just that the schedules had stopped. The problem was that the scheduling system itself, the software, the route optimization algorithms, the predictive modeling tools, was all human-built and human-owned. The consortium could see the system. They could not operate it without Terran authorization codes that were no longer being issued. It was the same story in medical supply chains, in agricultural export routes, in 3 separate interstellar banking clearing systems that nobody had known were running on human-designed protocols until those protocols stopped functioning. Everywhere consortium officials looked, they found the same thing: a human handprint on something they had assumed was simply theirs. On day 81, a Velhari military fleet of 12 warships arrived at the edge of Earth's solar system. The fleet commander, Admiral Sorath Vale, was not there to attack. He was not authorized to attack. He was there, as his official orders described it, to encourage diplomatic reconsideration through a show of measured resolve. What he found stopped his fleet cold. The Helios shell had not existed in any consortium intelligence report. It had not been detected by any survey mission or reconnaissance drone. It was, from the outside, nearly invisible, a distributed network of platforms, nodes, and automated defense systems that stretched from the inner solar system out past the orbit of Neptune. Vale's ships ran sensor sweeps for 6 hours. The more data they gathered, the quieter his bridge became. The shell was not just a defense network, it was a statement. It had clearly taken decades to build. It was layered, redundant, and designed by people who had studied every known weapons system in the consortium and planned accordingly. The Admiral sent a formal communication to Earth requesting a meeting to discuss the current situation. Earth responded after a 4-hour delay. The response informed him that Earth was not currently scheduling diplomatic meetings. The solar system's outer perimeter was now Terran sovereign territory. His fleet was welcome to remain at its current position or to leave. Any further advance would be considered a violation of Terran space. The Admiral sat in his command chair for a long time. Then he ordered the fleet to hold position. He needed to think. He needed to think for 3 days. Then he turned the fleet around and went home. While the consortium scrambled, Earth published. It started small. A series of academic papers released through independent galactic networks that had no consortium affiliation. The papers described breakthroughs in cold fusion containment that made existing consortium energy tech look like a campfire next to a sun. Then came the microfold drive designs, a system for short-range, faster-than-light movement that was cheaper, simpler, and safer than anything currently in consortium use. Then the medical release. For 300 years, a disease called Veth's syndrome had killed Zeth people slowly and without mercy. The consortium had funded research into it several times, but the funding was always cut when results were slow. The disease was not profitable enough to solve. A team from the University of Cape Town, working in partnership with a Zeth scientist who had been quietly collaborating with humans for 20 years, had solved it. The treatment was elegant, cheap to produce, and required no technology that any mid-level civilization couldn't manufacture. Earth released it for free. No licensing fee. No patent. No strings. It was published on open networks, accessible to any species in the galaxy. The gesture was not missed. Independent worlds that had long chafed under Consortium trade rules began receiving other quiet gifts: technical manuals, agricultural guides, infrastructure blueprints. None of it came with a bill. None of it came with a condition. It came because humans, even while cutting ties with an organization that had treated them poorly for 2 centuries, could not seem to stop helping people who actually needed it. On Earth, the 90-day period ended on a Wednesday. There was a small ceremony in Geneva where Secretary General Osei signed the final closure documents. It was attended by 30 people. There were no cameras allowed. When it was done, she walked outside into the afternoon sun, tilted her face upward for a moment, and then went back inside to have lunch with her staff. The Consortium's communication channels lit up with desperate traffic. Emergency sessions were being called. Economic committees were meeting around the clock. Species that had laughed at the human tantrum 3 months earlier were now sending quiet inquiries through back channels, asking if perhaps some kind of informal arrangement could be reached. Earth's automated response system handled all of them. It was polite. It was brief. It said, in several different languages, the same thing: "Thank you for your message. Earth is currently not accepting new diplomatic engagements. We wish you well." The galaxy had not been this frightened in living memory. Not because of a war, not because of a weapon, but because of an absence. Humanity had simply stopped showing up, and the universe, for the first time, understood exactly what that meant. 8 months after the severance, a document was leaked to the galactic press. Nobody knew exactly who leaked it. Whoever it was had clearly worked inside the Consortium's administrative core. The document was marked with 3 levels of internal classification, and it carried a seal from the Office of Species Relations, a quiet department that most people in the galaxy had never heard of. It had been written 14 months before the severance, requested by the Grand Council as a private briefing paper, and then buried so deep in the internal archive system that even most senior Consortium officials didn't know it existed. Its title was simple: The Terran Dependency Problem, a comprehensive assessment. It was 912 pages long. By the end of its first day in public circulation, it had been read by more beings across more worlds than any document in Consortium history. The opening paragraph alone caused immediate and widespread damage to Consortium credibility. It read, in cold bureaucratic language, that after a full assessment of Terran contributions to Consortium infrastructure, the Office of Species Relations had concluded that humanity had become, and this was the phrase that every press outlet in the galaxy pulled and repeated, the single most embedded non-charter species in Consortium. Operational history, to a degree that now constitutes a systemic vulnerability. The Council had known. They had known for over a year that if humanity left, the effects would be severe. They had denied the membership application anyway. They had issued a footnote instead of an apology after the colony ship attack. They had let it happen. The galaxy read all 912 pages. They did not read them happily. The report broke down human contributions into 17 categories. Each category was worse than the last. In the area of military support, it described how human soldiers had served in 63 Consortium peacekeeping operations over the last century, not as commanders, because provisional species could not hold command rank, but as the frontline troops who absorbed the highest casualty rates. In 31 of those operations, the report quietly noted, the missions had only been successful because human units had improvised solutions that Consortium military doctrine had not anticipated. In medicine, the numbers were staggering. Human doctors and medical teams had been deployed to 44 alien worlds during disease crises. Human pharmaceutical research, licensed cheaply to Consortium member states for decades, was now present in the medical systems of over 300 inhabited worlds. The report estimated that removing Terran medical technology from Consortium supply chains without replacement would result in significant mortality increases across multiple species within 18 months. In engineering and infrastructure, the document listed 47 major construction projects: stations, jump gates, orbital platforms where human firms had either led construction or served as primary technical partners. It noted that the maintenance protocols for most of these structures were written in human technical language, and that retranslating and updating them would take years. In diplomacy, and this section caused the most public shock. The report described how human diplomatic staff, despite having no official voting rights, had quietly resolved 39 interspecies disputes over the last 50 years by serving as informal mediators. The report used the phrase "preferred neutral party" to describe how other species had come to see humans, not because the consortium had given them that role, because species in conflict had started requesting human mediators specifically, knowing that humans had no political agenda to protect, no home territory to expand, and a strange, irrational commitment to finding solutions that worked for everyone. It was, the report concluded, a pattern of contribution so deep and so wide that it had been taken entirely for granted. The war in the Outer Reach started in the 5th month after Severance. It was not a big war by galactic standards, just 2 species, the Keth and the Muravi, who had been arguing over a contested mineral system for 30 years. The argument had almost turned violent 4 separate times in the past decade. Each time, it had been resolved quietly, without headlines, by a human mediation team from the consortium's informal dispute resolution office. There was no human mediation team now. The first shots were fired on a Thursday. By the following month, both sides had committed full fleet assets to the conflict. Consortium officials tried to step in. They sent Velhari mediators, who were distrusted by both sides for historical reasons. They sent formal council resolutions, which neither the Keth nor the Muravi acknowledged. They sent an economic incentive package that one side rejected and the other ignored. The war dragged on, ships were destroyed, settlements were evacuated. A species of about 400 million people on both sides began dying in a conflict that a single team of 8 humans had managed to prevent. Without weapons, without authority, without anything except the ability to sit across a table from 2 angry parties and make them feel heard. Grand Vizier Sorath of the Velhari watched the casualty reports come in each week from his office on the consortium's capital world. He was a careful and intelligent being. He had served in senior government for 40 years. He had built his political career partly on the argument that humanity was too emotional, too unpredictable, and too independent to be trusted with full membership. He called a private meeting with his 4 most trusted advisors. "We had it backwards," he told them. The room was very quiet. "We thought their emotions made them unreliable. It is their emotions that made them effective. They cared about outcomes. We cared about process. They were solving problems we were filing reports about." Nobody in the room disagreed. Meanwhile, 3 consortium member species had formally submitted petitions to renegotiate their membership status. The Doraki did it first. Their trade minister, who had been quietly building a relationship with Earth through independent channels for months, submitted a request to open bilateral trade negotiations with the Terran government. The consortium called it a violation of membership agreements. The Doraki pointed out, with some bitterness, that the consortium had not seemed particularly interested in membership agreements when their assembly lines were shutting down. The Mean followed 2 weeks later, citing medical supply issues. The Pale siblings, a quiet, careful civilization that had been in the consortium for over 3 centuries, submitted their petition in silence, without press release or public comment, and the brevity of the gesture was somehow more alarming than the other 2. On Earth, the news was noted. Not celebrated, noted. Osei's successor as Secretary General, a measured man named Kwame Asante, read the reports each morning with his coffee and filed them with his policy team for careful review. There was no gloating in the official government communications. There were no press conferences declaring victory. What there was, if you walked through any city on Earth during those months, was a remarkable sense of normalcy. People were going to concerts. The street food was good. A massive infrastructure project was underway to upgrade Earth's own internal transit network, a project that had been delayed for decades because so many of the best engineers had been contracted out to consortium work. Now they were home. and the work was moving fast. A journalist from an independent galactic news outlet managed to get an Earth press visa and spent 6 weeks walking through cities on 3 continents. Her report, published to enormous readership across dozens of worlds, was titled, "I went to find a planet in crisis. I found people living their lives." It was the most read piece of writing in the galaxy that year, and somehow, that fact alone frightened the Consortium more than anything else that had happened. The emergency summit was held in secret. That alone was remarkable. The Galaxy Consortium had not held a classified full council session in over 100 years. Everything the council did was, by its own founding charter, a matter of public galactic record. Transparency, the founders had declared, was the foundation of galactic governance. But this meeting could not be public, because what was going to be said inside it could not be heard by the 600 species who looked to the Consortium for leadership. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Grand Vizier Sorath called the session to order at the beginning of the 14th month after Earth's severance. Every senior delegate was present in person, not by hologram, not by representative. That too was unusual. The chamber, normally bright and open, had its external communication links disabled for the duration of the session. Sorath stood at the central podium and did not waste time. "The Keth Murovai War is in its 9th month," he said. "Economic disruption in the outer reach has reached a level our models did not predict for another 2 years at minimum. 3 member species are in open negotiation with Earth. 47 others have submitted quiet inquiries to their council, liaisons asking what the Consortium's long-term plan is regarding the Terran situation." He paused. "The honest answer is that we do not have one. And that is why we are here." The debate lasted 2 days. The old arguments were made. Some delegates insisted that offering Earth full membership now would look like weakness. Others pointed out that looking weak was already a settled matter, and the question was whether they preferred to look weak and stable or weak and collapsing. The Velhari bloc, for the first time in Sorath's memory, did not vote as a single unit. When the final motion came to the floor, the Velhari delegation for the first time in Consortium history abstained rather than vote against. The motion passed. Earth was to be offered full charter membership, effective immediately upon acceptance. Retroactive reparations for the Marin's Hope attack were to be paid in full. A formal apology, not a footnote, not a statement of regret, but a formal, recorded, legally binding apology was to accompany the offer. And Earth was to be offered a permanent seat on the Security Directorate, the 12-member body that effectively ran the Consortium's most important decisions. It was the largest concession package in Consortium history. The chamber was very quiet when the vote result was read out, not because anyone was surprised, but because everyone in the room understood what it meant. They were not offering Earth a seat at the table because it was the right thing to do. They were offering it because they had finally, completely, and undeniably run out of other options. The envoy fleet was assembled carefully. 6 ships, not warships. The Council had been very clear about that. Diplomatic vessels, well-maintained and visually distinctive. They carried the senior Consortium diplomatic staff, the best communicators, the most culturally experienced negotiators, beings who had spent their careers learning how to talk to difficult parties. They arrived at the outer edge of Earth's solar system and broadcast their arrival on the standard diplomatic frequency. Then they waited. They waited for 6 days. There was no response on day 1, no response on day 2. On day 3, a junior diplomat on the lead ship suggested they try a different frequency. On day 4, someone proposed sending a secondary message. On day 5, 2 of the delegates were having a quiet argument about whether Earth was making them wait deliberately or whether their communications were simply not getting through. They were getting through. Everyone in the fleet knew they were getting through. They just were not being answered. On day 6, at a precise time that happened to be mid-morning in Geneva, Earth's outer perimeter control transmitted a short message. It cleared the diplomatic fleet to approach to a designated holding point inside the solar system. It listed the specific coordinates, the approach corridor, the acceptable speed, and the communication protocols to be used. It was a very detailed message. It left no room for deviation. The fleet followed every instruction exactly. Secretary General Kwame Asante met the envoy delegation in a building that had been, before the severance, Earth's primary consortium liaison office. It had been repurposed during the 90-day wind-down and was now used as a storage facility for the Department of Infrastructure. Someone had cleared out one of the larger rooms and set up a simple conference table with chairs sized for a mixed-species meeting. There were no decorations. There was water on the table. The lights were at standard Earth brightness, which was brighter than several of the delegates preferred. Asante walked in, shook the hand of the lead envoy, a senior Velhari diplomat named Curator Vel Sarath, and sat down. His team of 4 sat with him. Sarath's team of 9 sat across from them. Sarath presented the offer in full. He spoke for 40 minutes. He was careful, respectful, and thorough. He mentioned the reparations. He mentioned the formal apology. He mentioned the Security Directorate seat. He mentioned the immediate removal of the provisional classification. When he finished, Asante nodded slowly. He reached across the table and picked up the formal offer document. He read it without rushing. He turned pages at a pace that suggested he was actually reading every line, not skimming. His team did not whisper to each other. They sat and waited. Asante set the document down. "Interesting," he said. He opened the folder his chief of staff had placed in front of him and slid a second document across the table to Sarath. "Here are our counterterms." The counterterms took 12 minutes to read and 2 hours to absorb. Earth accepted the membership offer in principle. It accepted the reparations and the apology. It accepted the Security Directorate seat. But it added conditions. The first was a Terran veto right on all Security Directorate decisions. Not a blocking veto, but a delay mechanism that would require any decision Earth opposed to be reconsidered with a full council vote. No other species had this right. Earth was not asking for it. Earth was stating it as a condition of return. The second condition was the removal of the provisional species classification from consortium law entirely, not just for Earth. For all 14 species currently carrying that designation, the consortium's founding membership categories would need to be rewritten. Every species that had been denied full rights on the basis of that classification would receive immediate status review. The third condition was the opening of the consortium's scientific archive, a vast collection of research accumulated over thousands of years, paywalled behind a fee structure that kept most independent and lower-income worlds from accessing it to open distribution. Not free forever, but free for a period of 50 years, long enough for the knowledge gap to close meaningfully. There were 7 additional conditions of lesser scale, each one carefully worded and legally precise. Sarath looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked up at Asante. "You prepared this before we arrived," he said. "We prepared it before the severance," Asante said. The room was very quiet. Across the galaxy, on independent networks that were carrying a live text feed of the meeting's key moments, someone on Earth's team had quietly authorized a partial broadcast species that had no consortium membership, watched the exchange in the outer systems, in the independent worlds that had been receiving Earth's freely shared technology for months. People gathered around screens in public squares. When the text of the counterterms appeared, the reaction was not quiet. The 14 provisional species still inside the consortium got the news within the hour. In some of their home systems, it was the middle of the night. It did not matter. People woke each other up to tell them. On the consortium's capital world, in the offices of senior delegates who were following the meeting feed in private, the mood was something that had no easy name. It was not anger. It was not quite shame. It was the particular feeling of realizing that someone you had underestimated had been the entire time 3 steps ahead of you. Sarath gathered the documents and told Asante his team would need to consult with the Grand Council. Asante said that was completely understandable. He offered them more water before they left. The Grand Council took 11 days to respond. Not because the deliberation took 11 days. The actual vote was held on the 3rd day, and the result was not close. The consortium accepted Earth's counterterms. All of them. There were 2 minor language adjustments proposed. Both were reviewed by Earth's legal team, approved as non-substantive, and incorporated without drama. The other 8 days were spent, as far as anyone could tell, on internal consortium politics, on managing the reaction of member species who were furious, on carefully wording the public announcement so that it read as a mutual agreement rather than a surrender, on deciding who would stand at the podium when the news was delivered to the galaxy. In the end, Grand Vizier Sorath delivered it himself. He stood in the main chamber with his 4 thin arms at his sides and read the agreement clearly and without embellishment. He called it a historic realignment and a new foundation for consortium partnership. He did not call it what it was. The galaxy was not fooled. But most of the galaxy did not care what it was called. They cared what it meant. What it meant, in practical terms, was significant. 14 species had their status reviewed within 60 days, as the new agreement required. 11 of them were granted immediate full charter membership. The other 3 were placed on an accelerated review track with a legal guarantee of resolution within 1 year. For some of those species, the wait for equal standing had lasted longer than human civilization had been in space. The news hit their home worlds in waves of reaction that no consortium press office had the ability to manage or contain. The scientific archive opened on a Thursday morning. Within 48 hours, 2 independent research groups, one on a small world called Verith, another, in a station, orbiting a dim star in the far reach, had each identified pieces of archived knowledge that would directly solve problems their people had been struggling with for generations. Neither group published their findings quietly. They published them loudly, with full attribution to the agreement that had made it possible. The Keth-Murovi War ended 17 days after the agreement was signed. It ended not because of consortium intervention, but because Earth quietly offered to send a mediation team independently, without consortium sponsorship. As a gesture of good faith toward 2 peoples, the consortium had failed. Both sides said yes. The team arrived. The war stopped. It had taken the human team 4 days. Secretary General Asante attended the formal re-accession ceremony in person at the consortium's capital world. It was the first time he had traveled off Earth since taking office. The ceremony was elaborate. The consortium put considerable effort into the aesthetics of it, the lights, the music, the arrangement of delegates. There were speeches from 5 senior consortium officials. The language was warm and full of references to shared futures and galactic community. When it was Asante's turn to speak, he was brief. He thanked the consortium for the agreement. He thanked the independent worlds that had shown solidarity with Earth during the separation. He acknowledged the 14 species whose status had now changed and said, plainly, that their liberation had been Earth's primary concern throughout the process, more important, he admitted honestly, than Earth's own seat on the directorate. Then he said something that was not in his prepared remarks. We did not leave because we hated this institution, he said. We left because we had to show you what leaving looked like. We hope no one ever has to do it again. He sat down. The applause was long and, in the view of most observers, genuine, not from the senior consortium officials, who clapped carefully, but from the hundreds of junior delegates and observers packed into the upper galleries of the chamber, from the 14 species, whose representatives were crying in their seats, from the people watching on screens across the galaxy who had spent 14 months waiting for this moment. Mara Osei did not attend the ceremony. She was at her home in Accra, sitting in a garden she had planted 15 years ago and never had enough time to properly maintain. She had retired from the Secretary General post 8 months after the severance, her stated reason being that she was 62 and tired, and the garden needed attention. Her actual reason was simpler. She had done the things she needed to do. There was no useful purpose in staying to collect credit for it. She watched the ceremony on a small screen she had set up on the garden table. She watched Asante's speech. She watched the applause. She watched the faces of the delegates from the 14 formerly provisional species, and allowed herself, privately, a few minutes of something that felt like relief. Her granddaughter, who was 9 years old and deeply uninterested in politics, came outside and asked if she could sit with her. Osei moved her tablet to make room. "What are you watching?" the girl asked. "Something that took a long time to happen," Osei said. "Is it good?" Osei looked at the screen for a moment. Then she looked at the garden. "Yes," she said. "I think it is. The academic paper that defined the era was not written by a human. It was written by a young Velhari scholar named Erith So, who was 26 years old, and had spent the last 3 years studying the severance period as the subject of her doctoral research. The paper was titled The Human Paradox on the Nature of Cooperative Independence in Emergent Spacefaring Civilizations. It was published in a mid-level academic journal, and, through no particular plan of its own, became the most cited paper in the field for the next 40 years. The argument at its center was not complicated. So wrote that the Consortium and the galactic community at large had consistently misread humanity by trying to fit them into categories that already existed. Humans were not a warrior species, though they could fight with terrifying effectiveness. They were not a diplomatic species, though they were the best mediators in the known galaxy. They were not a scientific species, a merchant species, or a colonial species, though they were all of those things depending on when you looked. What made humans genuinely unusual, so argued, was the combination, a species that cooperated deeply and widely with others, that gave freely and helped often, that formed bonds and kept commitments across species lines, without needing those commitments formalized or rewarded, and that simultaneously, without contradiction, was fully prepared to walk away the moment the relationship stopped being mutual. Most species, so explained, could do one or the other. They could be dependent and cooperative, or they could be independent and isolated. The two traits seemed, in every historical model, to push against each other. Dependence required trust. Independence required distance. It was extremely rare to find a species that maintained both at the same time. Humans did not find this difficult. It seemed, in fact, to be their natural state, so concluded with a line that was pulled out of the paper and repeated so often, it eventually became something close to a galactic proverb. The most dangerous thing about humans is not what they do when they stay. It is what they are when they leave, which is exactly themselves, unchanged. In the years that followed, things changed in ways that were hard to point to directly, but impossible to miss. The Consortium moved faster, not because humans demanded it, but because the lesson of the severance had been absorbed in a practical way. An organization that took 2 centuries to give a species voting rights was an organization that could lose another one the same way. Processes that had taken years began taking months. Complaints that had previously been filed and forgotten began receiving responses. The 14 newly recognized species changed things too. Fresh voices in the chamber, fresh perspectives in committees. Species that had spent generations watching the Consortium from the outside and had very specific opinions about what needed to be different. Earth held its security directorate seat and used it carefully. It did not try to run the galaxy. It attended meetings, asked questions, and occasionally delayed decisions it found poorly reasoned, which was enough, it turned out, to make the decision-making process substantially better. Humans kept doing what humans did. Doctors and engineers spread across the stars. Mediators sat in difficult rooms and found ways forward. Researchers published and shared. Pilots hauled cargo to places other ships didn't want to go. Teachers taught. Farmers farmed on worlds with unfamiliar soil. Builders built. They helped because they wanted to. That had always been true. The difference now was that everyone knew what happened when humans decided to stop. The cargo hauler, Steady Hand, was 3 weeks out from Earth, heading toward a small, independent world called Yeth that had no consortium membership and no particular strategic value, and a food supply problem that someone had asked for help with. The ship's pilot, a woman named Juno Park, was 41 years old and had been flying independent freight routes for 15 years. She liked the long hauls. She liked the quiet. She liked arriving somewhere that needed something and being the person who brought it. Her co-pilot was a young Doraki named Teresh, who had signed on 6 months ago and was still, occasionally, surprised by humans. "Can I ask you something?" Teresh said. "Go ahead. Do you ever worry they'll try again?" The Consortium. Treating your people like they did before. Juno was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the stars. They were very bright out here, this far from any sun, and they did not move. "Maybe," she said. "People have short memories. Organizations have even shorter ones. That doesn't worry you?" She thought about it honestly. About the Helios shell sitting quietly around her home system. About 912 pages of a report the Consortium had tried to hide. About 14 species who now had voices they had been denied for generations. About a war that had ended in 4 days. She smiled. It was a calm smile, the kind that comes from having thought something through, all the way to the end. Let them try, she said. We've had practice. She adjusted their heading slightly, and the steady hand kept moving through the dark, carrying food toward people who needed it, the way humans always had, and always would because they chose to, because it was right, and because no one in the universe had ever managed to make them do otherwise. Behind them, in the Consortium archives on the Capital World, a clerk was completing a long-overdue update to the Galactic Species Database. Under the entry for humanity, in the field marked classification, the old word had been removed. The clerk had been told to leave the field blank until a formal classification was determined by committee. Instead, she had typed 4 words. She was not sure anyone would notice. She submitted the update and went home. The 4 words remained. Do not underestimate. Ever.